Right now, thousands of homeowners across Britain are waking up to a terrifying reality. The house they bought, the property they've poured their savings into, could suddenly be classified as a mansion for tax purposes. And no, we're not talking about sprawling country estates with helicopter pads. We're talking about ordinary family homes in ordinary neighbourhoods. The Chancellor has opened a door that nobody saw coming, and what's on the other side could change everything you thought you knew about owning property in this country. The wealthy elite were supposed to be the targets, but the net is casting far wider than anyone anticipated. Your 3-bedroom semi in the suburbs might be next on the list, and the clock is already ticking. Before we dive deeper into this alarming development, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're your frontline source for everything happening in UK property, housing, and the economy. You need to stay informed about what's coming, and we're here to make sure you're never caught off guard. The proposal emerged from what seemed like routine budget discussions, buried in technical language that most people would scroll past without a second thought. But property analysts who know how to read between the lines immediately recognised something dangerous. The government is exploring a progressive property tax system that would see homes valued above certain thresholds facing dramatically higher annual charges. The official narrative focuses on properties worth over £5 million, painting a picture of oligarchs and billionaires finally paying their fair share. Sounds reasonable, right? That's exactly what they're counting on, because what the headlines aren't telling you is how quickly these threshold figures can be adjusted once the mechanism is in place. The infrastructure for a mansion tax doesn't care about the number you put into it today. It cares about the power you give it for tomorrow. Treasury insiders have been remarkably quiet about the specific valuation methods that would be used under this new system. That silence should worry you more than any announcement. Property valuations in the UK have become increasingly divorced from what ordinary people would consider reasonable. A modest terraced house in parts of London can easily breach the £1 million mark, not because it's luxurious, but simply because of where it happens to be located. Families who bought decades ago for 50 or 60,000 are now sitting on paper wealth that they never asked for and can't actually access without selling up and moving away from communities they've been part of their entire lives. Under the proposed system, these people would face annual tax bills that could run into tens of thousands. They're asset rich, but cash poor, and the government knows it. This isn't about fairness. It's about finding new revenue streams in an economy that's running out of easy options. The political calculations behind this move reveal something even more concerning about where the country is headed. Labour's core voting base has traditionally been concentrated in areas where property values remain relatively modest. Meanwhile, the constituencies that have swung away from them in recent elections tend to be precisely those areas where property prices have exploded over the past 2 decades. By targeting high-value properties, the government can claim to be going after the wealthy while actually hitting the middle-class homeowners who voted against them. It's politically convenient and economically devastating for millions of families. The rhetoric around fairness and equality provides perfect cover for what amounts to a geographically targeted wealth extraction scheme. And because it's framed as a tax on mansions, anyone who objects can be painted as defending the super-rich. The messaging has been carefully crafted to make opposition difficult. What makes this particularly insidious is how property values have been manipulated by government policy over the past 30 years. Planning restrictions have been tightened, making it nearly impossible to build new homes in areas where people actually want to live. Foreign investment was actively encouraged, driving up prices in major cities to levels that bear no relationship to local incomes. Monetary policy deliberately inflated asset prices through historically low interest rates and quantitative easing. Governments of both parties stood by and watched as housing became an investment vehicle rather than a basic necessity. Now, having created a property bubble through their own policies, they want to tax the people caught up in it. Homeowners didn't ask for their properties to be valued at current levels. They simply bought homes to live in, and the market went mad around them. But that won't protect them from the tax collector. The mechanics of how this would actually work should terrify anyone who understands bureaucracy. Every property in the country would need to be regularly revalued to determine which tax band it falls into. Who does those valuations? Government assessors with targets to meet and budgets to justify. What happens when you disagree with their assessment? You'd face a lengthy appeals process that most people simply don't have the time or money to pursue properly. The system would be designed to favour the state at every turn, with homeowners forced to prove their properties are worth less than claimed. It's guilty until proven innocent, applied to your family home, and even if you successfully appeal, there's nothing stopping them from reassessing again the following year. The administrative burden alone would be crushing, but the psychological impact of having your home constantly evaluated as a revenue source would change the entire relationship people have with home ownership. Historical precedent shows us exactly where this leads, and it's nowhere good. Council tax was introduced in the early 90s based on property valuations from that time. Those valuations were supposed to be regularly updated, but that's proven politically impossible, because actually reassessing properties would create millions of losers who would immediately punish the government at the ballot box. So instead, we have a system frozen in time, where someone in a modest flat in London pays more council tax than someone in a genuinely large house in the north. It's completely disconnected from current reality. A mansion tax would face exactly the same problem, but multiplied. The initial thresholds might seem reasonable to most people, but inflation alone would drag more and more properties into the net every single year. And just like with council tax, updating the system would become politically toxic. So instead, they'd simply keep collecting based on outdated figures that bear no relationship to what people could actually afford to pay. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. The impact on different regions would be wildly uneven in ways that expose the fundamental unfairness of the entire proposal. A £5 million property in central London might be a large flat or a townhouse. That same amount in other parts of the country could buy you a genuine mansion with extensive grounds and every luxury imaginable. But under a national property tax system, they'd be treated identically. The tax takes no account of why properties are expensive or what they actually represent in terms of living standards. Someone who bought in an area that happened to become fashionable through no effort of their own would be hammered, while someone in a genuinely exclusive property in a less pressured market would face relatively modest charges. It's a postcode lottery dressed up as progressive taxation. And because London and the South East have such a concentration of high-value properties, the tax would effectively be a mechanism for extracting wealth from these regions and redistributing it elsewhere. That might sound fine if you're not affected, but remember that economic dynamism and growth tend to concentrate in the same areas as high property values. Killing investment and forcing people out of economic centres has consequences for everyone. Foreign owners have already started moving assets in anticipation of measures like this, which tells you everything you need to know about who will actually end up paying. The ultra-wealthy have lawyers and accountants whose entire job is to structure ownership in ways that minimise tax exposure. They'll set up trusts, offshore companies, and complex corporate structures that make it nearly impossible to determine who actually owns what. Meanwhile, the family who bought their home in their own name and paid their taxes will have nowhere to hide. The tax will hit exactly the people it claims to exempt while missing the genuine high rollers it pretends to target. We've watched this happen with every other attempt to tax wealth or property over the years. The headlines promise to soak the rich, but the actual legislation always ends up drowning the middle class instead. And by the time people realise what's happened, the system is already in place and almost impossible to remove. The knock-on effects for the broader housing market would be catastrophic in ways that ripple far beyond those directly subject to the tax. Properties just below the threshold would become dramatically more valuable relative to those just above it. You'd see artificial clustering right at whatever boundary gets set, with nobody willing to pay for homes that tip them into the higher tax bands. Investment in property improvements would collapse, because why would you spend money making your home nicer if it just means a higher tax bill every year? The rental market would be thrown into chaos as landlords either exit entirely or pass costs on to tenants who are already stretched to breaking point. Foreign investment would dry up overnight, which might sound good until you realise how much of the construction industry depends on it. And perhaps most seriously, the entire principle of property ownership as a secure store of value would be undermined. If the government can arbitrarily decide your home is too valuable and tax you accordingly, what security does ownership really provide? You'd effectively become a tenant of the state, paying rent through taxation with no control over the amount. The constitutional implications should concern anyone who thinks seriously about the relationship between citizens and government. Property rights have historically been the foundation of individual liberty in English law. You can't be arbitrarily deprived of your possessions without due process. But a progressive property tax based on subjective valuations erodes that principle in fundamental ways. You might own your home outright with no mortgage, but if you can't pay the annual tax bill, what happens? Forced sale, compulsory purchase, a lien on the property that extracts its pound of flesh when you eventually die or sell? Every option represents a fundamental shift in what ownership actually means. You'd be holding your property at the pleasure of the government, dependent on their assessment of its value and their calculation of what you owe. That's not ownership in any meaningful sense. It's conditional occupation subject to ongoing approval from the state. And once that principle is established for property, what other assets might be next? Your pension? Your savings? Your business? The precedent is more dangerous than the immediate tax itself. Polling data reveals a fascinating disconnect between what people say they support and what would actually affect them. When asked if wealthy people should pay more tax, overwhelming majorities say yes. When asked if properties worth over 5 million should face higher charges, most people agree. But when you actually show people what their own homes are worth and ask if they should be taxed on that wealth, support collapses instantly. Nobody thinks their own property is a mansion, regardless of what it's worth. The family in the 4-bedroom house in the suburbs sees it as a normal home, not a luxury asset. But that's not how the tax system would see it. This disconnect is precisely what makes the policy politically viable despite its obvious unfairness. People support it because they don't think it applies to them, right up until the assessment arrives and they discover they're in the crosshairs. By then, it's too late to object, and the system is already extracting revenue. International comparisons show both why governments find these taxes tempting and why they ultimately fail to deliver what's promised. Wealth taxes have been tried extensively across Europe, and most countries have abandoned them after discovering they cost more to administer than they raised in revenue. The wealthy simply left, taking their businesses and investment with them. France's experience is particularly instructive. They introduced a wealth tax that was supposed to make the rich pay their share, and within a decade, they'd lost an estimated 42 billion euros in capital flight. Tens of thousands of millionaires relocated to Belgium, Switzerland, and London, ironically enough. The tax raised some revenue, but nowhere near enough to compensate for the economic activity that disappeared. Britain could be about to learn exactly the same lesson, except we're an island with limited geographic options for the affected population. So instead of people physically leaving, you'd see economic withdrawal. People would stop investing, stop building businesses, stop taking risks. Why bother creating wealth if the state just confiscates it through property taxation? The dynamic effects would be far worse than the static revenue projections suggest. The timing of this proposal couldn't be more revealing about the government's true fiscal position. They're running out of easy options for raising revenue. Income tax is already high by historical standards. National insurance has been pushed as far as it can go without triggering real political resistance. VT is maxed out within EU regulations we're still effectively following. Corporate tax cuts have been reversed, so they're looking at wealth and, specifically, property, because it can't move and it's easy to value. But this is the economics of desperation, not sound policy. When governments start taxing unrealised gains in asset values, it's because they've exhausted legitimate sources of revenue and need to plug holes in spending that's out of control. The mansion tax isn't about fairness or inequality. It's about a government that's spent too much for too long trying to find new pockets to pick. And they're betting that most people won't realise they're the targets until it's too late to stop it. The proposed implementation timeline shows just how quickly this could become reality if they decide to push forward. Initial proposals suggest the tax could be introduced within 2 years of enabling legislation passing. That means properties would need to be assessed, bans established, and collection mechanisms put in place in a very short window. The rush itself should raise red flags. Proper policy development takes time, with consultation periods that allow affected parties to respond and adjustments to be made based on real-world feedback. But when governments move fast on taxation, it's usually because they know that slower processes would allow opposition to build and kill the proposal. They want this locked in before people fully understand what's happening, and once it's law, removing it becomes exponentially harder than preventing it in the first place. The political dynamics shift entirely once the revenue is flowing and being spent. Taking it away means finding cuts elsewhere or raising taxes in other areas, and no government wants to do that. Estate agents and property professionals have been remarkably quiet about this proposal, which tells you they're caught between commercial interests and genuine concern. On one hand, anything that disrupts the market threatens their business model. On the other, taking a public stand against a tax on expensive properties risks looking like they're defending the rich. So instead, there's been muted criticism focused on technical implementation challenges rather than the principle itself. But in private conversations, the alarm is very real. They understand that a mansion tax would fundamentally alter buying behaviour in ways that could crater the top end of the market. Why would anyone pay $5 million for a property that comes with an annual tax bill of $50,000 when they could buy something for $4.9 million and avoid the charge? The cut-off would become a hard ceiling that properties couldn't break through, regardless of their actual value. And since property markets are interconnected, that compression at the top would ripple downward through every price band. The entire market structure could shift in unpredictable ways. Middle-class families who bought in the right areas at the right time now face an impossible choice: sell up and move away from jobs, schools and communities to avoid the tax, stay put and somehow find tens of thousands extra each year to pay the government, take out equity release products that gradually transfer ownership of their home to financial companies. None of these options are acceptable, but one will be forced upon them if this goes ahead. And that's before considering the emotional impact of being priced out of homes you've lived in for decades by a tax bill you can't afford. These aren't wealthy investors with diverse portfolios who can easily shift assets around. They're teachers, nurses, small business owners, and retirees whose property happens to be worth a lot on paper, but who live ordinary lives on ordinary incomes. The idea that they should be treated as mansion owners would be laughable if it weren't so financially devastating. But the Treasury doesn't care about individual circumstances. It cares about revenue projections and political optics. And right now, both point toward pushing this through regardless of who gets hurt. Legal challenges to a mansion tax would inevitably follow its introduction, but the scope for successful action is probably more limited than most people hope. Parliament is sovereign in the UK system, which means it can pass whatever tax legislation it wants without constitutional constraints that might exist in other countries. You can't argue that a tax is unconstitutional because we don't have a written constitution that limits government power in that way. The challenges would instead focus on implementation, valuation methodology, and whether the system discriminates against particular groups in ways that violate equality legislation. These are much narrower grounds that might win adjustments around the edges but wouldn't kill the tax entirely. And legal challenges take years to work through the courts, during which time the tax would continue to be collected. Even if you eventually won, getting your money back from the government is notoriously difficult. So while there would certainly be challenges, betting on them to save you from the tax would be unwise. The time to stop this is before it becomes law, not after. The generational wealth transfer implications might be the most consequential aspect of this entire proposal. Property ownership has been the primary mechanism by which ordinary families build and pass on wealth in Britain. Parents buy homes, pay mortgages over decades, and eventually pass them to children as inheritance. It's not glamorous or exciting, but it works. A mansion tax directly attacks this model by forcing ongoing payment based on accumulated wealth. Families that managed to buy in areas that appreciated dramatically would face the choice of selling to pay the tax or watching the value slowly drain away through annual charges. Either way, the wealth doesn't get passed down to the next generation. It gets extracted by the state instead. This represents a fundamental shift in the social contract around property and inheritance, and it comes at exactly the moment when younger generations are already struggling to get onto the property ladder at all. Instead of helping them, this policy would ensure that even those who stand to inherit property find that inheritance is dramatically reduced or eliminated entirely. The gap between property owners and non-owners would actually widen, not narrow, despite all the rhetoric about fairness. Pension funds and institutional investors who hold property portfolios would face their own calculation about whether Britain remains an attractive place to invest. These aren't individuals who can be shamed into staying for patriotic reasons. They are fiduciary entities with a legal obligation to maximise returns for beneficiaries. If UK property becomes subject to unpredictable wealth taxes that eat into yields, capital will flow elsewhere. That means less investment in development, less liquidity in property markets, and ultimately lower values for everyone. The people cheering for a mansion tax because they don't think it affects them would discover their own homes are worth less because the overall market has been damaged. You can't isolate the top end of a market and punish it without consequences flowing downward. Property isn't like income where you can tax higher earners without affecting lower earners. It's an interconnected market where confidence and investment at every level depend on the overall health of the system. Poison the top, and the roots die too. The environmental and planning policy contradictions reveal how poorly thought through this proposal actually is. On one hand, government policy supposedly encourages densification, better use of urban land, and development of brownfield sites. On the other, a mansion tax would penalise exactly the kind of high-value urban properties that represent efficient land use. A mansion in the countryside is one thing, but a valuable property in inner London often represents dozens of people living and working in a small geographic area with good public transport connections. That's exactly what planning policy claims to want. Taxing it heavily sends precisely the wrong signal and would encourage sprawl rather than density. It's almost as if the policy hasn't been thought through beyond the immediate appeal of taxing expensive houses. The secondary and tertiary effects have been ignored in favour of a simple narrative that plays well in headlines, but makes no sense when you examine it seriously. So where does this leave you if you're sitting in a property that might be affected? Waiting and hoping this doesn't happen is not a strategy. You need to understand your exposure and consider options before the policy becomes locked in. Get your property properly valued so you know where you stand. Consider whether structural changes might reduce your valuation in legitimate ways. Understand the options for ownership structures that might provide some protection. Most importantly, make your voice heard politically before this becomes law. Write to your MP. Join property owner organisations that are lobbying against this. Make noise on social media and in local meetings. The only thing that stops bad tax policy is political pressure, and that requires people actually engaging rather than assuming someone else will fix it. They won't. If you're affected and you stay silent, you're going to wake up one day to a tax bill you can't afford and no options for avoiding it. The time to act is now, while this is still just a proposal rather than settled law. The Chancellor stands at a crossroads with this policy. Push it through and raise some revenue in the short term while potentially devastating property markets and driving away investment. Or step back and admit that taxing unrealised gains in property values is economically destructive and politically dishonest. The smart money says they'll push ahead with some modified version that claims to address concerns while keeping the basic structure intact. That's how bad policy usually gets implemented in Britain. The initial proposal is deliberately extreme so that the slightly less awful sign that actually passes seems reasonable by comparison. Don't fall for it. A mansion tax at any threshold with any structure remains a fundamentally flawed idea that attacks the wrong people for the wrong reasons while failing to deliver the promised benefits. It needs to be opposed completely, not negotiated around the edges, because once the principle is established, everything else is just details that can be changed later. The threshold that seems reasonable today becomes confiscatory tomorrow. The valuations that seem fair now become weaponized later, and you'll have no recourse because you accepted the principle when it was first introduced. That's the real danger here, not the specific numbers being discussed now, but the precedent being established for future governments to exploit. Your home was supposed to be your security, the one asset you could rely on no matter what happened in the broader economy. That promise is being broken in real time, and most people haven't even noticed yet. The mansion tax represents a fundamental redefinition of property ownership in Britain, shifting it from a right you hold to a privilege you rent from the government. And if they can do it to expensive properties today, they can do it to average properties tomorrow. The mechanism doesn't care about the numbers you put into it, it cares about the power you give it. And once that power exists, it will be used in ways you never anticipated and never agreed to. This isn't about taxing the rich, it's about establishing control over the last major store of private wealth that governments haven't yet found a way to tap. And they're counting on you not understanding that until it's too late to stop them. Don't give them that opportunity. The fight starts now.